Okay, so welcome to an episode of the Dumble Podcast, and today I have a special guest with me, Scott from Hong Kong, and we're going to be talking a little bit about Hong Kong. So welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us. How about you tell us a little bit about yourself and how long you've been over on that side?
Yeah, sure. So I've been here for about 4 years now, and I also did 1 year living in Shenzhen before I lived in Hong Kong.
Right. Okay. And then so you went over there. So that would have been 4 years ago, and then before Shenzhen, where were you?
I was back in my home country in the UK.
Oh, okay. All right. And was this your first time living abroad after kind of leaving home, or did you go to any other countries before then?
No, this was actually my first time, just going to a foreign country by myself. Because before I traveled a lot with my family when I was younger.
Right.
But yeah, this is my first time living abroad, so it was quite an experience.
Wow, that's really good. And what a time to come to Hong Kong too, with all of this stuff, eh?
Oh yeah, it's an interesting time. Hey.
Yeah, so it's really this time it's really quite different what's going on compared to, for example, the Umbrella Revolution or Occupy Central, whatever it was called. It took quite a different tone this time. And then so you've got an interesting story about your journey from how you identified with them to moving more to a middle ground position, and we'll talk a bit about that in the group that you've started also. So how about you tell us a little bit about how you saw the movement and kind of how your thoughts on it evolved?
Sure. So when I first came to Hong Kong, I met my partner, who I'm still with today, and my partner has always been very sort of supportive of the democracy movement in Hong Kong. So I started learning a lot just from talking to her about things, and I thought that I would kind of give a lot more deference to her position since she was a local person. So I would assume that naturally she understands the situation here far better than I do. And, in many respects, that is, of course, true. I'm not going to come in here as a foreigner and say, oh, I know better than you. I'm not going to be like that about it. But yeah, so that was one thing. I mean, of course, being a Westerner myself, I guess there's always a kind of natural sort of sympathy for any kind of democracy sort of application. You would think that, oh, I grew up fine in my system, so why wouldn't we want it for other places, So yeah, but even when I first started learning about like how things are in Hong Kong with the politics and whatnot, there was always been a few things that kind of made me a little bit like, but I kind of ignored it because I saw that there was a bigger game at play with democracy, and I thought, this is more important. But there were always things like I saw the attitudes towards mainlanders, and that was one of the very first things I saw. Because for me, I came to Shenzhen first. So I interacted with mainlanders first as my interactions with Chinese people. And, I had a very good time interacting with mainland people in Shenzhen. I thought they were amazing people. They bent over backwards to help me. They were very friendly, and people argue that, oh, yeah, you only get that because you're a foreigner. But to be honest, on the scale I saw it, I don't really feel that is possible, to be fair with you. So anyway, right. I saw that a lot of the prejudices against people there, and I thought that, it's not really fair to kind of support that environment of xenophobia. And I never always associated the pro-democracy movement with that environment of xenophobia. I thought that maybe, it was an apolitical thing. It was just a standard kind of racism, whatever, But the more the democracy protest went on last year, the more I kind of saw how these kind of two things were attached with each other. And I think definitely from what we saw on Sunday, with a lot of innocent people being attacked in the unrest there, that again kind of confirmed it all to me, that what I thought was true.
Right. And so now your partner, are they taking more of an approach also where they're reevaluating the situation now, or are they still more on, are your ideas starting to kind of separate from each other, where you have very different ideas from your partner on what's going on?
Yeah, I think, because we've always been in a very much agreement sort of thing. And yeah, I think there is a bit of a drift between us in our political opinions now. But it doesn't cause any like personal conflict between us or anything like that. So we don't have to worry about like getting into arguments and breaking up or anything. That's going to be okay for us, I think.
That's really good. That is always a risk. I have a really good friend, a family friend of over 20 years, born and raised in Hong Kong. Well, sorry, she was born in Macau, but raised in Hong Kong. And I was always afraid to talk to her about my opinions on the subject, because you've seen my content. I'm a little bit more on the side of really against the protests. And you do have kind of a default opinion that most people in Hong Kong are kind of supportive of the protests. It is a lot more divided than people realize. I mean, if you look at the number of seats they got in the district elections, it looks like a landslide victory. But in fact, it was more like, what was it, 58% voted for pro-democracy, which still means there's a very large voice that is pro-establishment or whatever you want to call them. But with that in mind, I did not want to touch the topic with her. Because I didn't want to ruin our friendship, because that is definitely a risk. And so it's great to hear that that didn't happen for you. It turns out at the end of the story, though, she ends up seeing one of my videos on Facebook, and she says, "Oh, I had no idea you were active in this." And kind of then she opened up a little bit. She wouldn't ordinarily talk about it also because she works as a leader in the hospital system, and the hospital system is very much kind of pro democracy movement. And so that's something that she can't speak about at work also. But you must have seen that in Hong Kong. Lots of people, kind of relationships being broken. I mean, even families. I've heard of families like, kids and their parents, separating up because of this issue. Are you seeing a lot of that too?
I've heard a lot of it in the news. As for what I've seen personally, I've not seen it myself happen. Even in my girlfriend's family, there's not uniformity in their opinions. The father is more pro-establishment because he originally comes from mainland China. The mother was born and raised in Hong Kong, so she leans more towards the pro-democracy side of things. But I mean, again, it's not the sort of thing that people are going to start breaking up our family over. But yeah, I think some families, they're a lot more firm in their beliefs for certain individuals. So I think for some people, it does certainly affect them. And I've heard a lot of it in the news. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, one of the things you said, though, in terms of coming from mainland and being a little bit more pro Beijing or pro establishment, whatever it is, the interesting thing, though, is that doesn't necessarily always work out that way, right? Jimmy Lai is from the mainland, and he is the biggest xenophobic voice there is in terms of pushing this anti-mainland content in his Apple Daily and his magazines and stuff like that. So that's, I guess it doesn't always work that way. But in terms of you, when you started moving a little bit more towards the middle ground and away from just really saying, yeah, I support these protesters, did any of your other relationships around you, did anybody else start saying, oh, why are you going that direction? Or are you kind of distancing themselves from you or creating any conflicts in your relationships? Or everybody's been pretty okay with you moving towards a middle ground position?
I mean, yeah, for me personally, it's been okay. But I think at the same time as well, I kind of benefit here from being a bit of a foreigner. That, most of my friends in Hong Kong, they are also foreigners. So I think, it's fair to say most foreigners, especially the ones I interact with, they're not going to always live in Hong Kong permanently. So they don't feel so invested in the situation here that they're going to really be firmly for one side or the other. They kind of just observe the situation and go, oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I haven't lost any sort of friendships that I know about yet. I know there's some people I'm friends with who would not agree with me. I've talked to some friends back home as well who've got opinions, and they don't agree with me either. But these are people I've been friends with all my life, so it doesn't really bother me that much.
Right. So I guess that's an important distinction, is that being a foreigner in Hong Kong probably is quite different because, as you know, the person who we were interacting with on Twitter wanted to also talk to me, but then kind of backed out after she realized how aggressive the other side would get, talking about how to find her at work and things like that. And then she just said, I can't do this anymore. And, I've even got Hong Kong friends who are on the Shenzhen side here who don't want to talk to me because, like, no, I've got family in Hong Kong. So it creates an interesting kind of thing to think about, that there's no shortage of voices, anti-China, anti-establishment, anti-Beijing, whatever you want to call it. There's no shortage of those very loud voices in Hong Kong. But the other 40+% of people who do support it, you don't really hear from them that much. And so, which I feel like is a little bit ironic, because you've got this anti-mainland side, anti-CCP, whatever you want to call it, who are saying that they want to fight for free speech and democracy and the freedom of expression, but it's them who's preventing this other side, and them who's making this other side kind of scared to speak up. I mean, we saw it firsthand. And with this case, with this person we're speaking about, she didn't even outright just go pro-Beijing. She just said, okay, I want to start calling out the violence here. And even that was too much. And so is that something that frustrates you, that there seems to be a lack of voices that are really calling out the violence from the protester side?
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that led me to create the group that I've created now, is that I was always in like yellow, pro-democracy Telegram groups. And, I also, during the piece, I decided to join some blue groups as well on other social media platforms, just so I can kind of get both sides of the story. And as I was learning more, I would basically ask uncomfortable questions to either group. So I would ask the yellow group about like some of the violence or some of the xenophobia about the mainlanders. And then for the blue group, I would ask them about some of the, excessive force that I think the police have used from time to time. And what I found was a very different approach to my questions from either side. Now, when I asked the blue side about things that I thought would make them uncomfortable, they kind of responded much more rationally, and they were able to back up what they said with facts and stuff like that. They didn't say anything that they couldn't back up with facts. They didn't make up rumors or conspiracy theories or anything like that. But when I did the same thing for the pro-democracy side, that's when they start becoming a bit more vitriolic towards me. And I think, oh, okay, I'm not going to try and do that again, And that is what led me to create the group. I just want a space for people who, we're not like hardline Beijing loyalists or like we love communism or anything like this. We want to see a bit of a return to kind of rationality in politics. We want to see, protesters really having a bit stronger principles and not contradicting them as often as they do.
Right. Is that a lonely space in the middle?
Yeah. And the description of my group openly acknowledges that we have no friends, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, you because people just choose their sides and they kind of go to it, right? I mean, I've said that I would say I have a side. I'm not gonna lie. The stuff that I post is usually about criticizing the protesters. Now, mind you, I've come out and I've called out violence from both sides, and I've said that even though the Yanlong triad attack, suspected triad attack, was reported completely in a false way. There was way more two-sided than it was reported. Even that, I said that there probably should be an inquiry into what the police were doing while this was going on. This is a pretty big thing to happen while nobody's kind of showing up. So I'm willing to talk about that. I've called out specific instances of violence, but I have my side. It's still, even with that. But do you find, because here's the phenomena that I'm curious about too, is because when you move from being more really fully supportive of the protesters to a little bit more middle ground, is it a difficult place to keep your mind? Because I would imagine if you're all of a sudden attacked by the side that you just came from for doing that it kind of pushes you further and further over onto the other side, and you've got to catch yourself. And because I've seen this happen with other kind of anti-China YouTubers and stuff like that. Like they post one thing critical about China, and then there are some like Chinese nationalists or something that attack them on it. And then it makes them even more anti-China and more anti-China. I wonder if you have any of these battles where you get so fed up with the side that you're almost being pushed towards what would be considered my side, or you're pretty good at kind of maintaining that space in the middle. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I fully understand what you mean. I mean, I'm not sure if you've probably seen on my Twitter account, but I've been very involved in some debates with some trolls. And yeah, so, that can definitely make you lose faith in the other side and just think, God, they're a bunch of idiots, aren't they? Have they got anything right to say? But yeah, I mean, I can feel myself being pushed towards another side when I interact with some very distasteful people who claim to support a certain side. But I think, personally, it's always important to keep a rational head on and understand that, some of the trolls and bigots that you interact with, these don't necessarily represent everyone in the spectrum, And my idea of having my group is that, okay, these kind of extremists, these trolls, whatever they support, we're just going to block those guys out and they can just rot in the gutter. But at least we're going to have a space where we're going to just say no to all of that. You guys come here and we can have an actual discussion and conversation about things. And I think that this is the kind of thing that society needs in order to heal. That, people from both sides can come and just say what they feel, say what they think, and they can back it up with any facts or whatever evidence they think supports their claims. And if people don't agree, then that's fine. We don't have to agree, That's society. We don't have to. There doesn't need to be a uniformity of opinion. But at least we're not going to be, throwing constant insults at each other or just making random things up. It's going to improve the health of discourse. That's what I'd like to see.
Right. Yeah. Are you finding any movement in this? So your group is called the Green Group, right? Which is the mix of the
green space.
and you're on Telegram there, and I'll post a link to it afterwards. But are you finding that you're making a little bit of traction, or it's moving a little bit slow now? I would imagine with all the protests and the renewed kind of riots now, that I'm guessing it would be pretty difficult to pick anybody up. They're going to go to their sides and that's it. But am I wrong? Are you seeing some more people getting interested in finding a middle ground group like this?
Yeah, I mean, for one, I never expected many people to get on board with this in the first place. So, I always acknowledge that we're going to be a very lonely group and we're going to be very small. But at the end of the day, we have our opinions, we have our principles, and we're just going to stick to it, no matter if we're the only people on Earth that think that way, And at least we have a group where we're like-minded, we can come together and we can enjoy our own company, at least,
You're right, man.
It has been slow. We are up to like 10 members now at the moment. So yeah, it's pretty small. But it's nice at the same time. Despite how small we are, we're still quite a diverse group. We're not all just like white expats or local Chinese. There's a big mixture of different people in there. And yeah, I think, things will slowly pick up, I think, if more people get interested. And
yeah, it's about getting the word out too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's probably a lot of people that don't realize something like that exists. And then again, compounded by the difficulty of people just wanting to choose a side. But so now, in terms of, I mean, I guess what would be nice too. So right, it's a space to share ideas, but it would be nice if eventually, and maybe you guys have this plan, is to reach out to some of the thought leaders behind some of these protests. Because the one really big missing thing, like I was alluding to earlier, was
sorry, Paddy, I want to interrupt you there. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, I you broke up for a little bit on the start of that question. I couldn't hear you at all.
Let me make sure my internet connection is looking good. Yeah, okay. So yeah, what I was saying was what would be nice is if the group morphs into something also, and you may already have these plans, where you're doing these outreaches and you're talking to some of these thought leaders behind the protests to speak a little bit more honestly or unconditionally condemn violence. Because the thing that just kept blowing me away was that when you get people like Joshua Wong, who's celebrated as one of the heroes behind these kinds of movements, and he's asked a direct question: do you condemn the violence, against or these attacks? He's not willing to condemn it. So then you had Joey Sue, who went on a show called, I think it was called Hard Talk, and she was pressed over and over and over again: do you condemn this violence? She says, well, we will not be doing any condemning, and then you would think the people who are like Nathan Law or Sharon Hom, a human rights activist and lawyer, it's the same thing. It's that when you're asking them to condemn these violence, they do say, well, yeah, of course it was wrong. And then there's always a but. It's always like, but, they're fighting for the rights of everybody. This is why they're beating people up. And it's like, come on. We just need somebody to come out from their side and say that. And it would become a much more productive movement, I think.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. And I think that part of the problem is that what I mentioned before about like kind of peer pressure. I think that, not everyone on the pro-democracy side, even if they don't condemn the violence, they still don't necessarily support it. But they may they kind of be a bit too afraid to condemn it for fear of being called out as a traitor by their friends and whatnot. I think that's kind of what fuels a lot of the passive acceptance of the violence. It's not that people passionately or genuinely believe that, when 5 rioters are ganging up on one girl, that girl is an equal combatant in all of this, because obviously that's ridiculous, I think that a lot of people kind of feel that they have no choice but to just tolerate it.
Right. Yeah, that's a difficult thing to do then, if they agree with some of the underlying principles of the movement, but they have to do it unconditionally, and they have to do it without speaking up against all of these terrible kind of acts of violence from their side. That must be a really difficult position to be in. Now, so I guess you're saying you come from a democratic country, and so the default thought process for Hong Kong as well, it works fine for us and it's good, so of course, why can't we support it for Hong Kong also? So my question for you then is, do you feel like if you look at what's going on the ground, you look at it was just a little bit over 50% that voted for pro-establishment with the district council elections. You look at some of the really xenophobic things the district councillors openly say when they've got mainlanders living in their districts. Do you feel at all, if there was universal suffrage in Hong Kong and all of a sudden they followed a Western system where the person who managed to market themselves the best or who people like the most got elected. Don't you feel like there's a potential risk that comes with that also, considering how messy Hong Kong society is now? Or do you still have this idea that the default is they should have democracy because it's the right thing? Because my position, and I think maybe this is where we're going to differ, where we're going to have different ideas. My position is it's a little bit of a dangerous situation right now. There was an opportunity before to slowly work their way towards it, where they had a chief executive which was first vetted. There was a few options that were vetted to make sure that they weren't going to be working in the interests of foreign powers or whatever. I think that would have been a really good step. But to go outright, full on, vote for your leader, do you think that might be a little bit dangerous right now in Hong Kong?
So I'm kind of a little bit on your side there, a little bit there. So I agree that, the initial proposal for universal suffrage in Hong Kong, to vet the chief executive candidates, it was not unreasonable. It really wasn't. When you think of it in the context of, think about why would Beijing want to do this in the first place? Actually think about the actual reason they would want to do this. Do they care if a chief executive wants to raise taxes? Do they care if a chief executive wants to build more public housing? Do they care if a chief executive wants to legalize gay marriage? No, it's not their business. These are Hong Kong internal affairs. And these are the kind of things where, we can elect a chief executive and still improve Hong Kong through democracy within the one country, two systems framework. So, we do need some accountability for our chief executive as well, because right now they are not accountable to the people at all. They are accountable to, Beijing to implement national obligations, and they're obligated to the big businesses in Hong Kong to kind of keep them happy. But at no point are they really required to care about the people, because it doesn't affect Carrie Lam's job security. We saw all the riots last year. It doesn't matter to her, it doesn't affect her. So I think for these reasons that we do need some level of accountability in Hong Kong to make the chief executive obliged to listen to the people.
Do you think that if and when, so there's a few points I want to get back to on that, but if and when people were allowed to vote for their chief executive, do you think they'd need a national security law first before that?
Fair arguments. I think that talking in the current environment, maybe there's a fair thing to say that we need the national security law first. I was always of the thought before the riots that, we should do Article 45 first and then Article 23. That would make the most sense, because we say that, oh yeah, democracies have, all these national security laws, but then, the argument you can make from the yellow side of things is that, well, yeah, they're democracies. So if their leaders abuse their powers, they can get rid of their leaders in that sense. So, that was my initial feeling on that was the fair arguments for, get the chief executive elections first, then the national security, and then it's good. But obviously we've seen, evidence of foreign interference in Hong Kong by now. And yeah, I think that kind of creates the need for the national security law in the first place. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you look at, so I think from that point of view, you'd absolutely need that when there's a potential for a chief executive to be elected that may not have Hong Kong or, this region's interests at heart. So if you look at, so to me, when I was looking at this, and I don't know if this happened before you kind of moved towards the middle or not, but when I saw Joshua Wong going to testify in Congress with Denise Ho, Nathan Law, I think it was Nathan Law, and a few other people, and they're talking about how to contain China, and they're talking about how to, they're reminding the U.S. that China trades with Iran, and the U.S. is one of the few countries that walked away from that Iran deal to begin with. It's not just China trading with them. Which is another irony about the U.S. saying that China's untrustworthy and they don't follow contractual agreements and things like that. But that's a separate point. When I saw him doing that and actively talking about how he should work together with the U.S. to contain China, and then he flies back, nothing happens to him. He's walking around the streets fine. And then subsequently, U.S. senators also fly over to Hong Kong and walk around the streets with the protesters. I'm trying to imagine that in reverse, because there were independence protests in Hawaii. while that was going on. If you had the same thing of a few protest leaders from Hawaii fly over to Beijing to testify in front of the National People's Congress and talk about containing America, talking about releasing legislation to contain, the economic capabilities of America, and then they fly back to Hawaii and maybe bring some top Communist Party officials with them, I don't think that's going to fly. I don't know. And so I don't know what your if you were watched that was called the Summer of Discontent hearing is what it was called. I don't know if you were watching that, and if at that point you were already middle ground enough to look at that and say, okay, something's wrong here. So how did you see that? And or now looking back at it, would that be a pretty good argument that Hong Kong would need a national security law on its own as well?
Yeah, so when all of that was happening, that was at the time when I was still more or less fully in support of the movement. And the problem with that is, when you're fully in support of just one side, you're pretty much in an echo chamber most of the time, where you're only going to see what that side wants you to see. So I saw, Joshua Wong and Denise Ho and all these people kind of talking in US Congress, but it only goes over the points that the pro-democracy side want you to see. They're like, oh, we want human rights, freedom in Hong Kong, blah, 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 all those kind of, talking points that they usually parrot out. And yeah, of course, the way you say it there, like supporting another government to go against your country, it does seem very wrong. And this is one point where I feel that people in Hong Kong have not always given the framework of one country, two systems a fair chance. Because when you openly try to work against your own country, when you refuse to accept any compromises on the basis of one country for like national security laws or things like that, then how could you really say that you're respecting it? Like when Joshua Wong says he wants self-determination, which is just independence in a nice wrapper, that is not respecting one country. And if you don't respect one country, how can you expect two systems on a silver platter? It just doesn't make sense.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. So, all right. So while, because I watched the entire thing, I watched the entire Summer of Discontent. I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. But as you were saying, you were probably being given the clips that kind of showed them in the best light. But going back to your point about the chief executive, electing the chief executive, and right now they're not accountable to the Hong Kong people. They're mostly serving kind of Beijing and the businesses. Do you feel like? So I'll get into some questions about the Beijing piece in a bit. But in terms of serving big business, don't you feel that there's potentially a risk where if there were open elections in Hong Kong and they were running campaigns like other democracies where, whoever runs the best campaign has the best marketing wins, isn't there a risk that will actually create a system where the chief executive's even more so working for big business because these are the people who are going to push them to the forefront and get them elected to begin with? Or do you think that's kind of it's worth the risk? Or what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very fair argument to make. I think it's, part of the difference is that I think you come from the United States originally, and I come from the United Kingdom.
I'm Canada. Yeah. I was actually born in the UK though. I was born in London.
Really?
Yeah, I moved to Canada when I was 5. But yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. Sorry, are you not from the US? I made a bit of an assumption there. You not?
No. So I was born in England and I was raised in Canada. Yeah.
Sorry, it's the accent. I do apologize. I made an assumption.
Okay.
Sorry.
I didn't use enough A's, and the Canadian accent's gone a little bit. Only when I speak to Canadians, the really deep Canadian accent comes out, eh?
Oh, now I got it. Yeah. Oh, right. Okay.
But yeah, so from Canada, anyways. Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, often we think of like a US style democracy being corrupted by big business and lobbyists and all these kind of things. And whilst this is it does happen a lot across all Western democracies, I feel that personally in my country, in the UK, it's not as bad as a problem as it is maybe for the US. So that maybe that's why I think that that's not the problem at the forefront of my mind for democracy in Hong Kong, thinking that big business would definitely subvert democracy. But to be honest with you, yeah, it's definitely a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I've given a lot of deep thought to. I never think that our systems, our overseas systems, should change to anything that resembles China's system or Hong Kong's system. I just think before you're quick to change a system like we have over here, there needs to be a more deep conversation about, okay, what is democracy? What is freedom? What isn't being done now that could be done under a democratic system? Mm-hmm. And I don't think people should just be synonymously kind of connecting democracy with freedom, because first of all, in terms of that argument, the Freedom House shows that 70% of the world's democracies lack basic freedoms. They're illiberal, like, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, things like this. And then, so the second layer question for me is, okay, well, what is freedom? Well, I mean, according to the Cato Institute, which is not a pro-Beijing report, it's a 100-page report. They spend 3 pages bashing China. But when they look at the actual measurable freedoms in terms of size of government, taxation, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, incarceration rates, if I didn't already say that, Hong Kong is listed the 3rd freest place on earth, according to measurable freedoms by the Cato Institute. And that's above Canada. It's above the UK. It's certainly above the US. The US is in number 17. There's a lot of stuff that puts them down on the bottom of the list in terms of especially incarceration rates. So then the question is what is it that's going to be better? Like, can you think of anything specific, for example, where it's clear that the chief executive and the system has been just serving China? And do you think, because this is a question I've asked a lot of protesters also, I said, okay, if tomorrow all of a sudden you could elect your chief executive, what is the first thing that's affecting your daily life? What is it that you will change? And I don't know if you have any thoughts behind that, or if you have an answer about what could possibly change if just the system in which the CE is chosen changes to a democratic system.
Hold on, sorry a moment. Hello. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. So what I think about that is that you have to look at the real problems that people actually face daily in Hong Kong, the material problems that people actually have. And yeah, when you look at that, clearly the top of the list is housing. It's ridiculous how expensive it is here. We do have a situation which is unacceptable, that we've got people living in cage homes, or even they prefer to live on the streets, because paying $1,000 to $2,000 a month for a little cupboard that you sleep in is just not worth it, Yeah. So these are the things we definitely need to change. And my idea is that if we were able to select our chief executive, it would give us the ability to make things like housing an election issue. So, if we want more public housing, and if we want the housing market to not be so stacked against poor people and young people, then we could fight for that, and we could have an election campaign centered around that, where we pick the CE that's going to, do more things for us, essentially. So these are the kind of things that I think could assist us.
Yeah. So I mean that's something that I feel like, because I mean Hong Kong has, I think it's around 45% of the population living in public housing. It's huge. It's a massive amount. The numbers somewhere in and around there, maybe a little bit lower. But when it comes to a lot of land reclamation projects, to open up more land, you have a lot of the pro-democratic elected officials voting against these things and saying, oh, it's not going to be good for the environment, or things like that, or just find ways to filibuster, conversations around this. And it's like, I feel like these people who say this, who say, once we have a government that's elected, we can hold them more accountable. There are mechanisms to hold the pro-democratic lawmakers accountable right now, in terms of saying, why didn't you support this, and putting pressure on them. But nobody's using mechanisms, and they feel like this is just going to be some sort of a magic pill. If all of a sudden the system changes and they can elect even more of their government, including the chief executive, but they still don't do anything, I mean, I feel like nothing changes still. Nobody's pushing these legislators right now, and they can. Or they can vote, they can when they're campaigning, when the LegCo legislators or the district councillors are campaigning, the people can put pressure on them to say, I want to see somebody who these are the most important issues for. And so this picture that's been painted of Hong Kong is that everybody's so eager to be politically active, but everything shows that they haven't actually used the mechanisms. And I think you alluded to that too, when we're talking about the one country, two systems hasn't really been given a good chance.
Exactly. That's what I was going to make a point about as well. That again, this is the same thing, is that people haven't focused on the livelihood issues that have really been a problem for Hong Kong. All the political energy in Hong Kong has been wasted on the fight against the central government. And it's a futile fight, because people fight the central government over what sort of things. So national security, well, that's a constitutional obligation. You have to do it. There's no two ways about it. And really, their 2003 proposal was pretty mild. I don't know what we're going to get now, but that was definitely, you know, a lot milder than what we're going to get, I think. And then the high-speed rail. Why protest against that? If you don't like it, don't use it. No one's going to drag you off to West Kowloon, you know? So again, there are lots of these little things where I think that people just don't have the priority straight. And the only thing that matters is just resisting every single initiative the central government has in this city.
So what it looks like to me, and I don't know if you're getting more and more of a sense of this, and perhaps you do because you noticed how the anti-mainland sentiment kind of is wrapped up together in this protest movement, is that everything is just an anti-mainland thing. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter how it's proposed. It's just, you know, that's the main goal. It doesn't matter what's actually going on while that's all happening. And so you get all of these other excuses for this fight, but really that's what it's about. It's just being anti-mainland. I don't know if you get that sense or...
Yeah, to a degree, I think that is what a lot of people's thinking behind it is. I think a lot of people just have these kind of very xenophobic ideas about mainlanders, and then they will try to wrap up their xenophobic beliefs in all sorts of things. And you see the same parallels with right-wing movements in the West, where, you know, people who are racist, they won't necessarily come out and say, oh, I think black people are inferior. You know, they'll be like, oh, well, immigration is an issue. No. And, you know, they've always come up with a wrapper to sort of wrap their xenophobia around it. Yeah. I think, yeah, we've certainly seen the same thing here in Hong Kong as well. I don't think that it applies to every single person who's ever protested or cared about democracy in Hong Kong. I think there are plenty of people who, you know, are rational and they genuinely care about these things. But I think, yeah, a lot of people just use it as an excuse, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah, but I honestly bet, and I could be wrong, but I feel like anybody you ask who says that they want to be more in control of their politics, they want to be able to elect their chief executive, this is what freedom means to them. I really feel if you ask any of them in terms of whatever issues they're facing that they don't like about what the government is doing, what they're doing about Hong Kong, what have they done before that with the existing system to pressure their publicly elected, you know, district councillors or LegCo members? What have they done to put pressure on them to accomplish what they want, to address their grievances with Hong Kong society? I don't think you'll find anybody who has.
No, I've asked people that very same question as well, to be honest with you. And the closest to an answer I can get is that, oh, we have to deal with China first. You know, and like, what are you going to do? Like, these people are still assuming that independence is a possibility. It's like, even if they allow you to separate from China, you're not going to have a good time with it. You're still not going to have a good time, you know? There's nothing that Hong Kong can do about it. So to an extent, I feel that you just have to accept it, you know, just accept it as part of China, and there's nothing wrong with it. There's really nothing wrong with that at all.
Right.
Well, yeah. There are many worse fates that could befall Hong Kong than to be part of China. There really are.
Yeah. What I think is this is what I feel like the mainland kind of perspective would be, because maybe a lot of people will look at this and say, okay, so what? If they want to vote for a system that's going to make everybody's lives worse, at least, you know, if at least over 50% of the people want to do that, and they want the risk of destroying the city, why not just let them? Maybe people will have this idea. And so I think that's a bit obviously unfair for the other very sizable part of the population who doesn't want this kind of a separatist movement. But also from the mainland perspective, it's a national security issue, not affecting only Hong Kong, but China at this point. I mean, if you look at how China's being circled, and, you know, obviously the one that in terms of when you get into a debate with people about who's the more aggressive power, whether it's China or the US, you know, obviously the China's not participating in these regime changes and things like that. But the thing that they always point at is the South China Sea stuff, which does look pretty cheeky in terms of how far they're going out. But that aside, in terms of the territory that they inherited, they weren't going to militarize those islands. They had an agreement. They said that we have no intention to militarize them, and asked the U.S. to not patrol the South China Sea. And after that, shortly after that, they upped their patrolling of the South China Sea with U.S. military vessels. And that's when they're like, okay, here we come. And so that also has to do with the same reason that they can't just let Hong Kong turn into whatever it wants to be while there is this active effort from the U.S. to encircle China with this kind of influence, whether it be military bases and things like that. Obviously, you had the THAAD missiles in South Korea. That's my perspective of why it's an impossible ask at this point in time. No matter how you look at it, even if you look at it from an independent, what does it do to the actual people living in Hong Kong? And then from the wider picture, from a national security point of view, I totally see why this is a difficult thing for them to accomplish.
I agree. It's completely impractical. Yeah.
And but nobody's willing to, like you said, give this a chance at least to say, okay, well, what can we accomplish with the existing system? Nobody's tried.
Yeah, I think some people kind of did try, to be honest with you, because there were some pro-democracy parties that started with the rejection of the chief executive elections. And they wanted to continue down that path. It's what they call the third road, essentially, of just sort of, accepting that we want democracy, but we're willing to accept Beijing's terms on it, And yeah, I would very much consider myself in agreement with them. But the problem is that those parties themselves are irrelevant these days. They fell into the blue camp, and no one cares about them. So I'm like, yeah, okay, well.
So did they fall into the blue camp, or were they labeled blue camp because they were willing to make these small compromises, and then nobody wanted to support them because they didn't have a clear, distinct side?
Yeah, no. You got a very valid point there. Anyone who isn't like deep yellow is labeled as blue, and that is a fair thing. I think it's a combination of both things of what you mentioned there. I think on one hand, they were getting labeled blue so much by all the yellow people that they may have just got sick of it. But in the end, they did start, telling their voters to vote for DAB candidates in their pro-establishment candidates in their local district. Really? Yeah. So, they're firmly in one camp these days.
Well, it might be that thing I was telling you about, that you just get pushed so much that you're like, okay, all right, fine, I'm going over to that side. That kind of phenomena that I was asking you about. And whether you feel those forces on you also, because as you said, there's a little bit less capability of having a rational discussion with people who are really kind of hardcore protest supporters. And I can imagine the ways that I've seen some of the screenshots of the ways that you get attacked sometimes too. It's pretty vicious. And ironic also, using like homophobic slurs to attack you when they're supposed to be about freedom and democracy and the rights of others. Like, it's like, what's going on here? Hold on a second. That was interesting.
Yeah, this is the kind of hypocrisy that makes me think that, my God, how did I ever support you guys?
Yeah.
How was I ever in the same bed as you people?
But then, like I said too, that must be it must be a pressure on you that kind of potentially pushes you even more towards what would be something like I call myself a side, even though I'm willing to see it from both angles, but I still say that I have a side. You being pushed more towards like my direction, it must be hard sometimes when you're encountering stuff like that. But like you said, you just got to remind yourself, not everybody's like that. The idiots are obviously the loudest ones as well. And I think it's something we need to keep in mind, because I like what you're doing. I like this idea of having a middle ground. Obviously, it failed for the party you were talking about before, but hey, you know what? It's worth a try. But getting the principles right, standing up against the things that happen on their side. I mean, they would get so much more support from so many more people also, I think, if they did that. At least collectively, if you have just a few individual people standing out like you and some others saying, guys, this really looks bad. We shouldn't be doing this anymore. You get attacked right now by that side, because there's this unwritten rule that you should never condemn anything that the protesters do. But if there was just enough people, if it got enough momentum where people realized and said, okay, hold on a second, guys, this isn't really doing our image any good. They're lucky they have the media on their side, though, because the media helps them cut all of that stuff out. Like the attack videos that I share of, the multiple women who have been attacked by gangs and stuff like that. That's not being aired on the news overseas. Nobody's seeing that.
And I'm following all the, pro-democracy accounts on Twitter, and I'm not seeing a peep out of any of the stuff that I've seen coming out of the pro-establishment Twitter accounts. And, the best I've seen is that, they've made it up, or they've created an old video or something.
They always say it's the police. They always say it's the police.
Oh yeah, that too. Yeah, yeah. So,
Yeah.
oh, look at the clothes they're wearing. Oh, they all wear the same clothes. Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and it's a circular logic. It's there's absolutely no reasoning with them because for example, even when you finally see, because there are undercover cops who dress up as rioters who try to catch them, and you've seen them. There was the video in I think it was in Newtown Plaza where two undercover cops jumped on these guys who were smashing the shop, machines up and stuff like that, and arrested them. And so what that should say is, yes, there are police in rioter gear, and this is what they do. They arrest people who are vandalizing things. But what they ended up saying in that camp on that side was that, oh, you see, they do dress up as rioters. But they completely left out the point as what are they doing when they dress up as rioters? They're not smashing the shops. They're catching the people who are smashing the shops. And then the next day they go back to saying police are smashing the shops in rioter clothing. It's... yeah,
that kind of logic, you can't really argue against it. And I think, people who insist on believing that kind of thing, we're never going to agree on anything, So I'm kind of happy to just let those people go off, do their own thing, believe what they want to believe. And yeah, I can just ignore that. I'm only interested in talking to people who are actually, willing to look at things from a different perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like there's so many of them, and maybe there'd be better traction with focusing on people who aren't necessarily supporting it, aren't necessarily coming up with these stupid explanations to excuse away the violence from the protesters. Because in their case, they're seeing the violence and then they're basically creating a narrative for it. But the people who aren't being exposed to this, who are just quiet, maybe there's a chance to get through to them to say, guys, we just need more people to kind of speak up against this. If you look at at one point in the protesters were comparing themselves to Tiananmen Square, the 1989 protests. And the thing that the 1989 protests had was they actually had student voices who were speaking out against the violence, because they did get violent too. There were civilians being beaten up. There were police officers and soldiers who were burnt to death. And there were people who stood out and said, this is wrong. We shouldn't be doing this. And I remember one student interview also, they were talking about how they were blocking the classes so that no students could go to the classes, and they would encourage people to go over to the square to protest. And there were also some students who were involved in the protest who said, guys, should we really be doing this? I mean, we're doing the exact same thing we're accusing our own government of, kind of this authoritarian kind of, not allowing people to choose on their own. Maybe we shouldn't be doing that. There was actual voices, reasonable voices during that movement. And it seems like there really aren't any amongst the leadership on the Hong Kong side. I don't know if you can recommend anybody to me, anybody who's in a leadership or very influential who supports them, but also says, guys, we need to reevaluate. We can't keep doing this.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. And to be honest with you, yeah, I don't know anyone who's kind of in a big position, who's in a, they're very influential. I don't know anyone influential who's willing to kind of take a step back from some of the extremism that we're seeing in the movement. I think that anyone who's kind of really put themselves out there in support of the movement, they've kind of made their bed now, I feel. And that's probably how they feel about it too. So they're just going to stick to their guns to the very end, I think, for some of these people.
I think they're probably very aware how dangerous the truth is and how they'll be attacked if they do say anything. And it happens in all societies. I'm reading a pretty interesting book right now called Has China Won? And it talks about what China does well, what it doesn't do well, what America does well, and so on. And they mentioned the unwritten rule in American politics, for example, is admitting that China is, potentially going to be, the number one or exceed them in terms of economic status or whatever it may be. That's an unwritten rule. You're not allowed to say that in the U.S. And that's why the book mentioned that Bill Clinton it was his last day of presidency. That was the first time he said Americans need to get used to the idea that America soon might not be the sole kind of global superpower. And he would never dare say that during his term, because it would just be like, how dare you even suggest that we're not going to be number one in the future? So I think every place has its own kind of a thing. There's certain unwritten rules. And it seems like for Hong Kong, the unwritten rule is don't condemn anything that the protesters do. Don't admit that we did anything wrong. That seems to be what the unwritten rule is.
Well, to be honest, the rule itself is not even unwritten. If you look at some of the origins of the protests from where they first started for the extradition movement, A lot of the protest activities were being organized on a website in Hong Kong called LIHKG or Lingdan.
Oh, right.
Yeah, Golden or something like
that. They were
that.
doxing police families and stuff like that on there too, I think, right?
Yeah, they do stuff like that. They're essentially Hong Kong's equivalent of 4chan, more or less. If you don't know, yeah. Like that sort of. But yeah, a lot of the discussions first about the protests on there, they had a kind of a slogan there which they used. It was no condemnation, no division. And this is a principle that they stuck to, essentially. And this is why they refused to condemn the violence, because from their view, if they condemn the violence, then they will separate from the violent members of the protest movement. And what their plan is, essentially, is that, you know, there are the peaceful protesters and there's the violent protesters. And these are kind of two different camps in the pro-democracy movement. Now, before, there had always been a lot of conflict between these two online. They would always argue about, like, you know, oh, we shouldn't be violent. Oh, no, we should be peaceful. And, you know, all that kind of stuff. But what they've done for the movement is they've essentially said, okay, in this case, both of us want the same goals. So neither of us are going to argue or criticize each other. Both groups are going to work as one, and we're just going to accept everything that each other does. So, you know, the Braves, as they're so called, the violent radicals, they're not going to call out the peaceful people saying that, oh, you're not doing enough, you're a bunch of pussies, and and then the peaceful people, the Wale Fei, if that's how I say it correctly, I can't speak it that well, but they won't call out the radicals and say, oh, this is too much, this is too violent. So it's kind of like a truce between both sides, essentially.
That's like, well, only the peaceful side lost out in that deal. It's like, if the worst the violent side could do is call them pussies, I mean, go ahead, you know. Yeah. It's like, I think, and that's not. I mean, that's they're still using their time. They're not pussies. So it reminds me of a phrase that it reminds me of. It says, you know, don't tell lies about me, and I won't tell the truth about you. And instead, it seems like they came to a truce, an agreement where only the violent side really wins in that agreement, because they just get to keep doing what they're doing, and nobody calls out what they do.
Yeah, I think the reason for that was, you know, the peaceful side thought that if they supported the Braves on a large enough scale, then it would attract more people to become Braves. They would have an actual chance of winning, essentially. I believe that's what motivated them to kind of drop their principles a bit. Just thought that, okay, if we just allow for a bit of anarchy, then we're going to have an actual chance of getting what we want.
After that point, was there a sudden drop in activity in terms of people talking about the violence afterwards also? Like, so even the peaceful guys, they wouldn't bring up any of these issues and say, guys, this is pretty, you know, bad. From that point forward, the conversation kind of stopped about the violent acts?
Yeah, for me, I was in groups of, you know, English-speaking groups. So I was mostly interacting with, like, you know, foreigners, things like that. And there were some locals who could speak English too. Yeah, during the first couple of months of the movement, there were a few people coming on a bit like, are we being a bit too violent here? Are we being a bit hypocritical? And then pretty much all those people were immediately shouted down as being Wu Mao and CCP apologizers and all this kind of stuff. And, you know, that really kind of shut down a lot of their discussion on that side, where people knew how certain people would react if you tried to talk about certain things, and they just didn't bother trying in the end. They just thought, oh, well, you guys are going to do what you want to do.
Wow, that's such a shame. There was a chance for those voices to be heard. And it would be so much more easy for other people. I mean, especially on the mainland side. You know, on the mainland side, there were people who didn't really think one way or another during the you know, the umbrella protests and the umbrella revolution, Occupy Central, and what they've done has actually turned people away from them. You know, like I've got some really good friends here who they're mainlanders, born and raised. They studied overseas, they worked overseas, and they always respected Western systems, Western democratic systems, and the way things are done outside of China. And it wasn't until after these protests and the violent protests in Hong Kong last year where they completely changed their mind. They said, you know what, I'm pretty happy with the system we have here. I'm glad that it's the way it does. There's a lot of people don't realize there is an accountability system built in. There is a way, there are local officials who are regularly overthrown after they've done something wrong to the people. This is something that happens regularly, and they're just happy with the fact that things are going the way that they're supposed to go. The handling of this pandemic is a perfect example of that too. We're open. I'm in my brew pub now. We're open. We've got customers. My kids gone back to school. Like, that was kind of a double hit. Then the people here were like, they're looking at how people are handling it overseas. Well, mostly America is really kind of, you know, messing it up in a pretty big way. And they've become even more sure about their system. But what those violent Hong Kong protesters, what they were doing without reflection, they lost so much support from people in the mainland who would have otherwise supported them before. And I think mainlanders have also woken up to the fact that how much of that xenophobic kind of component is connected to it as well. But those voices that you're talking about who are shut down early, it's a real pity to hear that, because they could have accomplished so much more. But now, mind you, they obviously have the media on their side. And, you know, history may also kind of delete all of this other stuff, because there's plenty of other events throughout history that are written and remembered in a way that's very different from how it actually happened. So maybe that's what they're counting on also.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I think they were counting on, you know, being the victors to kind of rewrite history, you know, that would justify all the things that they've done. But of course, you know, when you think about it realistically, it's just not going to happen the way they think it is. No way.
Yeah. I mean, you had a couple of people. I don't know if you know the story of the Canadian Toby Gu. He put on a press vest and he came over to capture. He wanted to capture police violence. He wanted to show on his YouTube channel how brutal the Hong Kong police were. And on his first night, he captured a scene of Hong Kong protesters beating the crap out of a man, like beating him unconscious and then continuing to beat him. And he says, "Holy crap. I didn't see any police brutality, but this is what I saw." And he uploaded, and he didn't really add too much of a commentary. And after that, he was attacked in Hong Kong big time. Now, he's Asian looking, so I think that made him a little less safe than if he was just looked like a foreigner. But even respectable one, it's supposed to be respectable. I don't call them respectable, but Hong Kong Free Press, they've been neglecting to cover that kind of a violence in any sort of an honest way for a long time. They show some of the protester violence sometimes, but it comes with a narrative that kind of softens it a little bit. And Tom Grundy, the CEO of Hong Kong Free Press, what he did was when after Toby Gu posted that video, he put out a notice to his followers on Twitter with Toby's picture, and saying that this guy's pretending to be a journalist. And he was already locked up in his hotel room. There were death threats against him. They said, "We've got knives for your throats." So the death threats were already out. And then Tom Grundy added on top of it by putting his picture out and saying, "If anybody sees him, please confront him."
Ooh, I did not know that.
Yep. Oh yeah, I'll share the I don't know if he deleted the tweet or not, but I have a screen capture of it, and I called him out on it, and then Tom Grundy deleted or blocked me on Twitter after that. But it's like that's how much the press is on their side. That you've even got Hong Kong Free Press, which is supposed to be this honest, you know, unbiased outlet, doing this kind of stuff, basically putting hits out on journalists who cover the stuff that they've been trying to keep covered for so long.
Yeah, and it's unbelievable that they would do something like that. You know, that's incredibly irresponsible. You know, I hope he did delete the tweet and understand what he did was very irresponsible there. But I think you should at least kind of look into the circumstances surrounding someone before you make a comment like that about them. Definitely.
Yeah. I mean, his willingness to do something like that in his position, it says a lot about what's really happening. You know, so his position of outrage was that he is basically, he's putting on this press vest and pretending to be a journalist, which puts journalists at risk. And this is really wrong to real journalists. And the thing is that Tom Grundy, he never once called out the rioters who were using press vests, because there are videos of people in press vests trying to hold police back when they're trying to arrest somebody, putting their foot out and tripping them while there's a chase going on. He's never talked about those people posing a risk to real journalists, because it does. Because now when police are out there, they have to treat all of these press vests, all of these journalists with suspicion. That's why when you had that video of them crowding in on an arrest, and they're crowding in, they're circling in, the police took their pepper spray out and warned them and then sprayed them. And then that video went everywhere saying, "Oh, the Hong Kong police are cracking down on the journalists." It's because of those journalists who were using those vests to protest and riot in. Not some guy coming in and doing what the real journalists were supposed to be doing all along. That's not the guy who's, you know.
I remember seeing that very famous photo from a few weeks ago. There was some protest. They were trying to restart the movement in, I think it was Sha Tin, Newtown Plaza. And it might be the same when you're describing. I think there's about a group of 30 police officers on the floor, and then there's about 140 counted journalists surrounding them. And I think that, you know, okay, we have freedom of press here in Hong Kong. We have a lot of different like news outlets for like, you know, paper or online, but we don't have that many. Not 140. That's a bit excessive. I think that's too much, you know. So yeah, if the government wants to start cracking down on certain things, like making sure that we have press IDs that are a bit more robust to being checked to validate people as being real journalists, I wouldn't be surprised if they do something like that. And again, I don't think it's unreasonable if they did.
Yeah. We are talking about the same video. Yeah, they were crowded around, and when the videos went out, they cut out the parts where there was one lady in the crowd of journalists who, I don't think she was wearing a press vest, but she started hitting one of the officers with an umbrella also.
Yeah,
and then that's when the pepper spray came in. But the umbrella hitting part, that got cut out before it went across to international audiences, you know. Yeah, but you're right. That, you know, the journalists, you see some of these protests, the journalists outnumber the protesters. It's like, what's going on here?
Yeah, you don't see that anyway. Like, you look at the things happening in France and whatnot, you don't see that at all. You do not.
Well, you've seen the shops that are selling the press vests, right? You've seen their little corner shops, and they've got you know, racks and racks of press vests that they sell to these protesters.
I haven't seen those. I mean, I've walked around a lot of the hardware shops in Tai Kok Choi and places like that, you know, and I've seen that these are clearly like places to kit you out. But yeah, I haven't seen press vests being sold. No.
Yeah. The laser pointer thing has stopped though, right? Because that was laser pointers were really popular in the beginning, and they're quite dangerous. The ones that they're using, the number of milliwatts that they're pointing into people's eyes. But I don't really see too many people using the laser pointers anymore, right? They were being sold all over Hong Kong at that point.
Yeah, I don't know what happened to them. I'm not sure if they banned them.
It kind of seems like it disappeared overnight.
Yeah, you know, it is literally like they disappeared. I think it was just when they first started using the laser pointers, I think that was kind of like their way of being peaceful, essentially. You know, they were thinking that, okay, we're not throwing petrol bombs, we're just shining a light in your eyes. You know, there are worse things we could do. So maybe that was their way of doing that. But I think as the tactics became increasingly more violent, I think the laser pointers may have just like lost relevance, essentially.
Yeah,
because you know, why shine light in someone's eyes when a petrol bomb to throw? You know what? Obviously, one is going to be
exactly. Well, the petrol bombs, there haven't been any recently in the new protests, though, right? Because I know one of the big warehouses for the petrol bombs was on the university campus, and they see when the police went in, they seized thousands of Molotov cocktails and equipment and stuff like that. It was a really professional operation. But in these last few days, have there been? I don't think there's been any new reports of Molotov cocktails being thrown. Do you know?
No, nothing being thrown. There were reports this morning where they had found some petrol bombs that were supposed to be used today for the LegCo meeting that's happening right now for the reading of the new law. But yeah, I mean, I think what the police have done now, I was talking with my group about this morning, it seems to be the case that they've increased their ability to kind of act preemptively on some of these threats for petrol bombs and stuff. So I think there may have been a time when people were able to kind of manufacture these things privately and move them around without detection. But whatever the police have done to improve their capabilities, I think now they're kind of a lot more onto people when they're making these.
Yeah, they probably know the warning signs of what to look for, or keeping an eye on the supply chain and stuff like that. Yeah, that's
because, you know, Hong Kong has no previous history of terrorism or anything like that. So, you know, as much as we have police who are trained in anti-terrorism here, there's just not the experience of knowing to, you know, look for people who are buying certain chemicals online or look for people who are searching for particular keywords and stuff like that. You know, it's always been a very lax situation with security in Hong Kong until last year.
Yeah. You'd almost think that they'd start relying on a lot more outside help. And in that regard, are you surprised that the mainland just hasn't intervened, like that they haven't sent military in or anything like that? Is this anything in any of your groups that people were saying that this is eventually going to happen? Like, were people counting on it happening before? And are they still counting on it, or lost hope, or they never really thought it would happen?
So when I was in the yellow pro-democracy groups, that was a big fear of a lot of people there, was that, you know, the violence is going to get to a point where it kind of spills over and it's PLA on the streets. The protesters, they did officially have a kind of plan for if the PLA on the streets, or if the army are on the streets. They just said they would go home and stop protesting. That was their official plan for military intervention. They would just give up. But yeah, I mean, looking back on things and how things have played out, certainly me and some people in my new green group, we certainly recognize that Beijing has actually been pretty tolerant with everything so far.
Yeah.
So the new national security laws coming in now, it's not a surprise given that.
Yeah. I know there were a couple of groups that tried to go out to the PLA barracks. There was one in Shek Kong. They showed up, a group of them, and then the military held up a yellow flag that said, "If you come any closer, we'll shoot you." And then they just turned around and went back. It was like,
Yeah.
They tried to go close to the Kowloon Tong barracks also, and I think there was a report where they triggered the gun, they went, and just made the sound, and then they scattered, they went, they left. But yeah, they've been kind of just keeping hidden away there, haven't they? But would you say that the protests that are going on now are any more violent than they were before, or they're kind of just more of the same thing?
To be honest, now, in the last few weeks when they've tried restarting the movement, I think it's been a bit of a failure for them, to be fair. They just haven't got the numbers that they used to have.
It's lost steam.
Yeah, it's completely lost steam, yeah. I think, I would hope at least that the pandemic piece has made people a bit like me, essentially, that, we've had time away from the violence where we can kind of calm down from the emotional sort of aspects of everything. We can look into things and actually research things and take the time to do these now. And yeah, I think hopefully a lot of people have been like me and kind of softened their views and taken a more side of, okay, we need to look at practical, achievable things if you want to protest for it and actually make Hong Kong a better place.
Okay. And then, so now, in terms of what's next, I'm curious, before I move on to there, is how does, because you're with your partner being a local, obviously I'm kind of surrounded by people who are Hong Kongers who are celebrating the the introduction of the national security bill, which is weird in itself. Like, nobody goes around in life saying, I want a strong national security bill. Nobody thinks that. And now that we've got to this point where I literally know Hong Kongers who are opening up bottles of champagne because they have a national security law, things have gotten bad. They're like, okay, they just want this to end. So I know about the people who are celebrating the idea of this, but from your group, and your partner is a local and stuff like that, what's the sentiment from them? Are they scared? Are they worried? Are they really disappointed in it? Or are you having any conversations around this? What's the mindset in the groups that you're surrounded by in terms of the national security law?
Yeah, sure. I mean, going on to my partner, for one thing, as much as she's always been very supportive of the pro-democracy movement, she's always kind of been not that firm or deep in her beliefs about it, So, for example, when it comes to like boycotting luxury brands like Apple and stuff like that for their support of the government and whatever sort of thing, then she won't do that. That's too much of a impact on the convenience and quality of her life for her political principles. So you can kind of see that to a certain degree is a bit superficial, if you understand what I'm saying. Like, I respect her views completely. I'm not saying that she's not sincere enough or anything like that, but you understand where I'm getting at. The priorities.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think, even though she herself is not worried because, she knows she's done nothing wrong, she kind of has this idea that it's going to restrict freedom of speech in Hong Kong, and it's going to lead to all sorts of other things where, people are going to be forced to like be loyal to the Communist Party and all this kind of nonsense. And honestly, I think this is just exaggeration. It's the same exaggeration I've been seeing in Hong Kong for a very long time. And this is another thing which I saw before the protest, is that a lot of Hong Kongers have a habit of exaggerating how bad things are, even if it's not in politics or even in their daily lives and things like that. There is a tendency to kind of blow things out of proportion.
Yeah. I mean, I really don't think it's interesting, and it's an interesting dynamic, because I don't think we would have this national security law, at least right now, at least this soon, if it wasn't for what these protesters were doing, and if it wasn't for what things like Joshua Wong was doing, going over to Congress and stuff like that, and encouraging foreign interference. But it's interesting to see the different kind of sides and how, because I agree with you, where there's a lot of people that have been saying for a long time, this is going to happen, we're going to lose our freedoms. They've been saying it since, it's handover, right? And it hasn't really happened in any significant way in terms of daily life, day-to-day life. But we'll see where it goes. So what's next? What do you hope happens? Where do you hope this goes from here in terms of protesters? Because obviously the protests, they got what they wanted in the beginning, which was the removal of the extradition bill, And so now there is an admitted murderer walking around in Hong Kong freely. And I don't think anybody's really concerned about him, right?
No, and that's kind of the sad thing, really, is that, you know, he was completely an afterthought, even though he was the entire reason for the extradition bill in the first place. He was a total afterthought. Okay. And I remember Chan Tong Kai, the guy who was the murderer, who murdered his girlfriend in Taiwan. He got released from Hong Kong custody because they took him on technicality.
Yeah, he was willing to go back.
Yeah, he said he's willing to go back, but then when is he going back? Because it's been a while now.
Well, so Taiwan blocked it originally. Like Taiwan said, so when Taiwan didn't want to do it through an extradition bill, and they said that they wanted him to, it had to be done in some way other than in an extradition bill. So while he was in prison, there was a pastor who talked to him and got him to agree to fly back to Taiwan after he was released. And so that became news, and it was big news. It's like, okay, so justice will be served. And Taiwan, what they did was they immediately blocked him and the pastor from being able to enter Taiwan anymore. They said, no, you can't get on the flight to come here. They said, if you want us to do it, you have to allow us to send Taiwanese police to Hong Kong to make the arrest in Hong Kong. So basically, they wanted Hong Kong to give Taiwanese officials jurisdiction and authority in Hong Kong, which of course they're designing a situation that China would never, ever agree to. So people who were skeptical on whether Taiwan was playing a political game with this or not can rest assured now it was just a political game. He's willing to get on a flight. He's willing to fly over to face the crime that he committed of murder in Taiwan, and you're not letting him fly over because you want to add this extra thing where you want jurisdiction in Hong Kong. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is another thing which I've missed being in my echo chamber, that I didn't know anything about what Taiwan did following that. Because as far as I know, the story ended when Chan Tong Kai said that he was willing to go to Taiwan. I thought, yeah, fair enough. And I didn't hear anything else about that afterwards.
No, they blocked him and the person who convinced him to go back from being able to enter Taiwan. And they said that was the conditions. Yeah, I don't know, again, what happened after that, but I think enough time has passed where probably this guy's going to be like, you know what, I don't want to spend the rest of my life in jail anymore. And so now these Hong Kongers are protesting the fear that they're one day going to be kidnapped and murdered by the CCP while they are okay with an actual murder walking around in their neighborhood. It's like, when you really think about it, it's like, come on, guys, when are we going to actually really think about this in a logical way?
Yeah, and this is what is infuriating when you're trying to like talk to these people in a rational way. And you can understand, as what you said earlier, you get pushed to one side, and this is where some of the trolls come from, because they think, I'm not going to engage properly anymore. I'm just going to make fun of you guys now. That's all it is, you know?
Yeah. But yeah, it's unbelievable. So back to my original point, the extradition bill was successfully withdrawn, and then the protests continued on. And then, of course, one of the most ridiculous of the 5 demands in my mind is the amnesty for protesters, especially how anybody in their right mind, after the street cleaner was killed, with a brick, that man was lit on fire, police was stabbed in the throat and is still going through speech therapy a year later. Another police officer has acid burns all up his body. People have been beaten in the streets, and they want these people to have amnesty. They want them to not face justice for what they did, and they're simultaneously saying they care about rule of law. So it's morphed into this weird thing. But where do you think it goes from here, or what do you hope happens? Like, if you could design in your mind the perfect situation for what happens, what the government agrees to, what the protesters agree to, who goes home, what do you think should happen from here, or would you like to happen?
Okay, so for me, from here, this current situation, what I want to see happen, or what I hope will happen at least, is that obviously now we're going to get the national security laws. Following that, I think that, Beijing will do good on its promise to maintain the freedoms in Hong Kong that we've had this whole time. And I think that it will actually kind of force a return to rationality in Hong Kong politics. It's going to take away a lot of the extremists who are poisoning the well. Because these people, you can't convince them either way using any facts or logic you try. They're only going to believe what they want to believe, and that's it. Simple. So what else can you do other than just kind of, we just need to have this return to this ideas of peace and principles, where we don't think it's okay to justify the means. The ends justify the means. We don't think the ends justify the means. Yeah. So
right.
Yeah, you understand what I mean. From there, I think that we can start having some real healthy, practical discussions in politics about what things are we actually going to try and achieve in Hong Kong from now on. What material changes are we going to make to the way things work around here that it's going to actually improve people's lives?
Right. Yeah. Are you worried at all that it's too late in the sense that Hong Kong will never be the city that it used to be? The idea, let me kind of justify even thinking about an idea like that. So, there's very few mainlanders interested in going to Hong Kong anymore. They've kind of written it off in their mind. And when you had economic programs like the Greater Bay Area Project that the mainland put together, where Hong Kong had exclusivity on financial related matters. Like each city had their own specialty. Shenzhen was tech. Zhongshan was something else. Guangzhou was something. Zhuhai was something else. So for Hong Kong, they had exclusivity on things like, I think blockchain technology was one of them also, and finance. And so after a lot of the incessant kind of, especially from people like Joshua Wong saying, we're so important, the mainland needs us. Most of China's foreign direct investment comes through Hong Kong, as if that's as if that's not by design by Beijing. They started pulling some of those things back. They started saying, okay, no, you don't have exclusivity on the Greater Bay Area Project anymore. They started offering a lot of great incentives to Hong Kongers who are kind of fed up, who want to come over. They say your kids can go to school for free here. You can purchase properties like locals. You can enter into, this was around for a while, enter into universities with much lower requirements and things like that. It seems like decoupling is the word that everybody uses around the world right now. It almost seems like there's a somewhat of a decoupling where a lot of people have given, a lot of the most important people that Hong Kong needs on its side has given up on them. And so do you fear at all that in many ways it's just, it's too late for Hong Kong to ever be what it was before? Or are you a bit more optimistic than me?
Yeah, I think I am, to be honest with you. I don't think it's impossible for Hong Kong to kind of bounce back because, this is not the first crisis we've had. It may be one of the worst, but it's not the first. And Hong Kong has a history of bouncing back. So, to be fair, I think that, we still occupy a very unique position in China. And I think that is always going to play to our strength here. No matter what happens with unrest or anything like that, the fact is that, two systems are still in place here, regardless. So that is still making Hong Kong useful for China and for the rest of the world. So, I think that hopefully now with this national security law, we're going to see return to peace and rationality, and hopefully that was going to create the conditions for Hong Kong to kind of bounce back.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope you're right on that. I mean, Hong Kong's an amazing city. It's a beautiful city. I've always thought it was one of the best cities in the world. It's just so unfortunate what's happening for so many reasons. Also because the one country, two systems could have served as a great example for reform on the mainland side. There were rumors I heard that Shenzhen was looking at putting in together kind of like a district council election kind of a thing before the Hong Kong protests. And it's pretty much off the table now. It's not even being discussed anymore, which is annoying too, because had Hong Kong shown a better example of how to use their freedoms, which are admittedly far more than they have on the mainland, it could have been great for reform on the China side. And in that regard, I almost wish the national security law was in place earlier, because then maybe you wouldn't have had a lot of this BS where Joshua Wong thinks it's okay to go over to the US and encourage legislation like the Human Rights and Democracy Act to try to contain Hong Kong, which was also the weirdest thing I've ever seen, is people from a country or region begging for sanctions while people in other countries are dying from sanctions. You got Hong Kongers saying, please sanction us. It was the weirdest, but I hope you're right, though. I hope there's a way to bounce back from this, and that some of those rational voices start to get heard a little bit more. And if your green group can play a part in that, that will be amazing. I'm going to leave a link for people who want to get involved in that. I'm sure there's still going to be debate. I'm sure there's still going to be some arguments between people who are, even if they say they're center, they happen to be leaning towards one side or the other. But hopefully it will be a healthy debate, and it will be a healthy conversation.
Yeah, I mean, we've already seen that already, essentially, that and most people in my group, they're kind of leaning more towards the blue side already, and there's a minority of people who lean more towards the yellow side. And generally I'll try and sit in and mediate when they're arguing between each other to make sure everything's all civil and all that. And yeah, they've been fine so far. I think it's been very healthy what we've seen of the discussion. When I look on Twitter where it's completely unmoderated and people can just throw whatever toxicity they want at each other, then yeah, it's just trash. It's absolute trash. There's no discourse whatsoever. But then on this group where it's like we have rules and you have to no trolling or no bad faith business at all, then it cuts out a lot of the bullshit before it even starts.
Right.
So
yeah,
we can actually have productive, healthy discussions on these matters.
Yeah, that's a good approach. Okay, well, I think we'll wrap it up there. We've been going on almost an hour and a half here, and but thanks a lot for chatting with me. And then if you ever find yourself over here, make sure you come by my brew pub. We'll have a beer together. And
sure, yeah. I've been for years, but yeah, let's go back.
Yeah, that sounds good. So I'm going to leave a link in the description to your group, and thanks again for joining us.
All right, thank you.